Claire Cushman, editor of the Supreme Court Justices Illustrated Biographies. What kind of information will people find in this new book?
Well, mostly they'll find all the basic facts about each justice, their birth date, their death date, their parents' names, where they came from, where they were born, what their early education was like, their first job, how did they become a Supreme Court justice, why were they chosen, who chose them, how did they perform on the Supreme Court, briefly what their judicial philosophy was like, and some of the major cases they were involved in.
How did this book come about?
Well, the Supreme Court Historical Society has long seen the need for a single-volume reference book about the Supreme Court justices. We started to develop it about 3 years ago in conjunction with Congressional Quarterly.
Talk about that relationship. Congressional Quarterly does other sort of big books about Washington, and how did the Society and the Quarterly work together?
Well, it was the Society's idea to do the book. We had been developing the manuscript, and one day we got a call from CQ asking if we had any projects in the oven, and we told them about this one, and they came aboard to be our publisher.
Tell us a little bit more about the Society and its work.
The Society was founded in 1974. It's a non-profit, private educational institution. Its mission is to educate the public about the court and its history. It does this primarily in 3 ways. The first way is by acquiring memorabilia and artifacts, busts and portraits, to give to the curator of the Supreme Court, who then displays them and uses them in educational exhibits. The Supreme Court Historical Society also is involved in educational projects of writing about the court's history, primarily the documentary history of the Supreme Court, 1789 to 1800. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it seeks to reconstruct the court's records during that period. A lot of them were lost and are fragmented. It's an 8-volume series, of which they've put out 4. So the Supreme Court Historical Society supports that. And thirdly, we sponsor lectures and educational projects about the court.
How did you become involved with the Society?
I was hired to be its Director of Publications 4 years ago.
On this project, how many people were involved?
I can begin to count quite a number. Since there are 106 justices, we had to go out and find experts to write individual biographies. Some wrote more than one. Several staff members contributed biographies to this project, especially on the justices that are less well known or have had less research done on them. Then we also had a panel of experts who are mostly constitutional law professors and historians of the court who reviewed and critiqued the biographies. We also had a team of fact-checkers that checked all the facts for accuracy. We had a team of photo researchers, actually primarily one photo researcher who dug deep into the archives around Washington, trying to find rare historical illustrations that hadn't been used in a lot of other publications. Let's see, who else was involved? The Supreme Court curator was involved in providing photographs. The Supreme Court Library also was very helpful in developing the bibliography, which is quite extensive, and also includes a bibliography on juvenile literature on the court, which is something unusual.
You talked about the biographers involved, and some wrote more than one. How were the biographers chosen?
Well, in some cases it was very obvious. There's one living expert who has written the biography of Holmes or Brandeis. Actually, in some cases there are more than one, but the Supreme Court Historical Society had developed relationships with some of these people in the past, so it was very easy for us to call on them. We had worked with them on one of our other publications, the Journal of Supreme Court History. For many justices out of the 106, there was no immediately obvious expert for that justice, so we picked somebody who was an expert on that time period, or we even went to find people who worked at local historical societies that had an expertise in the region that the justice came from and was able to furnish information about the justice that had not come to light previously, because no one had really taken the time to dig deep into the origins of the justice's life.
Before we get into some of those lives, you mentioned also a children's bibliography?
Juvenile literature, reading for juveniles about the justices and the court, yes.
What did you find when you looked into that? Are there things for youngsters to read about the
Yeah,
courts?
there are quite a few. Of course, most of the juvenile literature concentrates on a few of the great justices. There are several works on John Marshall, the great Chief Justice. There are quite a few works on Thurgood Marshall. And there are a few general works on the Supreme Court. Oh, also on Sandra Day O'Connor, for obvious reasons, I think. The first woman, the first African-American.
You served two roles. You not only wrote some of the biographies, but were also editor. Explain how you balanced both roles.
Well, I edited all the biographies for style and content, but I wrote the biographies of the justices that I was most interested in, and in a few instances, ones that I couldn't find anyone else to do the job.
Who then, as we get into their lives now, in looking, I know you specialize in the ones you wrote about, but you do know about them all. Who most intrigued you of the more than 100 justices? I know it's hard to narrow it down, but...
That is a really tough question. Well, there are aspects of every justice that surprised me and intrigued me. Let's see.
Well, the very first person in the book, in fact, one you write about is John Jay.
Well, John Jay is a fascinating individual. A lot has been written about him. He's much better known for the work that he did off the court than on the court. His involvement in the Jay Treaty, his negotiations with Great Britain while he was a Chief Justice was certainly something that surprised me. Today's, when one looks at the roles of the justices today, that kind of extrajudicial activities would be unheard of. But that's mostly due to the changing, I think, ethical standards and also role of a justice.
What did you find out, and we'll talk some more about many of these others in your writings, and again, we'll just start with John Jay, about them just as people, almost sort of their everyday lives?
Well, unfortunately, in a 5-page biography, you don't get to dig that deeply. John Jay was an aristocratic, very cultured man. He organized, I think, what was it, the New York Dancing Society. He was very much a man about town, kind of a dashing figure, which is not something that you normally would know from looking at pictures of him in his solemn robes.
You write about also John Rutledge.
John Rutledge is a very interesting case. He was both Chief Justice and Associate Justice, but he never attended a formal session of the court, which is very hard to explain. He served twice on the court as Chief Justice and as Associate Justice, but for various reasons he never attended a formal session of the court. I'll explain. First, as Associate Justice, he did ride circuit, but he did not go to the court. The court was originally in New York. He never went to New York to attend a session because he was ill and he was busy with other things. He rode on the circuit. And he resigned from the court one day because he was sick of essentially circuit riding, which was a very arduous task in those days, and he went back to South Carolina. He was an aristocratic planter from South Carolina and had been very active in the early, how should I say it, the early political movements in South Carolina. And he just decided that being a Supreme Court justice wasn't as exciting as being a state court judge, so he went back to his hometown, Charleston. And then as the court grew in prestige and he got tired of doing estate and will cases, he wrote to George Washington and said, "I'd like to come back on the court." He was appointed Chief Justice during an interim period, which was during the August term. And he presided over the court for that month. But when the Senate came back into session in November, he was not confirmed. So he served as Chief Justice, but he was not confirmed by the Senate. So he had a very odd career on the Supreme Court.
You mentioned riding circuit. What did that entail?
Well, when the Judiciary Act of 1789 provided for district court judges and Supreme Court justices, but no circuit court judges. So what happened was one district court judge and 2 Supreme Court justices had to cover the circuit courts. This entailed great sacrifice on the part of the justices because they had to cover long distances to perform the circuit court functions. And in those days, the accommodations were terrible. Transportation was very slow. The food was bad. They were lonely. They complained incessantly about the arduous of circuit court writing. And it wasn't until, believe it or not, the end of the 19th century that finally the burden of circuit writing was abolished. I mean, there were several limited attempts to reduce their burdens, and they were, but it wasn't until the creation of a federal appeals system that they were relieved of that.
Did that duty rotate among the members of the Supreme Court? I mean, did everybody at some point do that?
Well, at some point, the real problem was the Southern Circuit, which was from, I guess, Virginia all the way on down. And it was, I can't remember exactly how many miles, but it was a long, long circuit. And at some point, John Rutledge, who had to ride that circuit, said, you know, I can't do this anymore. So they passed a law that said that a Supreme Court judge, Supreme Court justice would not have to ride the Southern Circuit 2 times in a row.
You also write about many people, heard of John Jay and John Rutledge, but you also write William Cushing.
Yes, William Cushing, the reluctant revolutionary. He's an interesting fellow because he was very ambiguous about whether he wanted to, well, whether he indeed joined the revolutionary cause or not. He, the issue was whether, well, this is when he was on the lower court in Massachusetts. He was from a Massachusetts justice, and he took in a very crafty way, decided to not let it be known whether he was a patriot for the revolutionary cause or not. The issue was whether judges of the Massachusetts court would get their pay from the Crown as well as being appointed by the Crown, the British Crown. And some people felt that they should have their salaries appropriated by the Massachusetts legislature so that they would not be so dependent on the Crown and they could be impartial. And this was the big issue of the time. And William Cushing made it known that he supported the legislative excuse me, what's the word?
That's right.
Approbation, but he did not take a big stand on it. So he was, he hedged his bets on that one.
The reluctant
Yes.
patriot. Bushrod Washington, a relative of George Washington's?
Yes, he was George Washington's nephew. Excuse me, and George Washington didn't have any children, and so he took a great interest in the career of Bushrod Washington. However, he did not favor nepotism, and in several instances he was very careful not to advance his nephew's career because he didn't want anyone to think that he was pushing him in any way. However, he gave his nephew advice, and he also paid for his legal tutelage under James Wilson, a Philadelphia lawyer of great renown who eventually became a Supreme Court justice as well.
And I always say the last name incorrectly, Roger Taney?
Taney, that's the way I pronounce it too, yeah. Well, of course, Roger Taney is known for the Dred Scott decision, and for a long time I think he was vilified for that. What was interesting to me in researching his life is how, what a great Chief Justice he was, and I think how unfairly his reputation has been tarnished by Dred Scott.
Now explain why you think he did a great job and it has been tarnished over the years.
Well, he wrote a lot of other important decisions. The Charles River decision, let's see, the Merriman decision. He was a very careful and fair judge, and Dred Scott was, I mean, I can't say it was an anomaly, but it was something that he has been unfairly blamed for, I think, in being the Chief Justice.
So far, we've talked about people from the very early days. In a minute, we'll talk about some from the more modern times. But in those early days, was there anything you found that these people had in common?
Not as much as you think. They were all mostly from very privileged backgrounds. Their parents tended to be very well educated. There were a few that were sons of blacksmiths, but in general they were sons of ministers or lawyers, and they all have a legal background, which is not at all surprising, except that the Constitution provides absolutely no criterion for becoming a justice, so they could easily not have had a legal background and still been technically appointed. Let's see.
That legal background in those early days is different, though, than today. How did, in those early days, they go about learning the law?
Well, mostly they read law with another attorney, a lawyer, which meant...
Is that an apprenticeship?
Well, it's kind of an apprenticeship, yes. I mean, they essentially worked in an office with a lawyer and learned the trade by watching and doing. In some instances, it also meant, sweeping the floors at the end of the day, too.
In more modern times, you've written about a dozen of these, but closer to our age, you wrote about Abe Fortas. What did you learn about him?
Well, a lot of people say, Abe Fortas, but wait a minute, he wasn't a Supreme Court justice. He didn't make it onto the court. Everybody remembers the big controversy of when he was nominated to become Chief Justice, and then through Life magazine brought to light this scandal of his involvement with the Wilson Foundation, and he did not get that. He was not promoted. However, he was an Associate Justice, and he was very interested in juvenile law. That was one of his specialties. He, what can I say about him? He was a great music lover. He was on the board of the Kennedy Center, and he played in a string quartet.
No kidding.
Mm-hmm.
Well, talking about the kind of the everyday life of those early justices in more modern times, did you find that the modern justices are more involved in those kinds of things, more social kinds of activities?
Well, I would say that the modern justices have spent most of their careers within the legal profession, which is not at all true for the 19th century justices. So in that respect, you find justices that have more varied interests, I think, in the 19th century. For instance, was it Samuel Miller? He was a doctor. He was a physician before he became a lawyer. They came from more varied paths before they made it to the court, whereas in the 20th century, most of them went to law school, did very well, joined a law firm, maybe worked in public service as a lawyer or for the government, but they tended to have a narrower path.
Of the sitting justices, you write about one, Clarence Thomas. What did you write about him?
Well, I think the American public is very familiar with Clarence Thomas's story, his humble origins in Pinpoint, and how he made it all the way up to the court. He is a very fascinating individual who's had quite a rich life. I enjoyed learning about him.
What did you find, if any, difference in writing about sitting or living justices as opposed to the justices of history?
Well, sitting justices are much harder to write about because you don't have the historical perspective. If you will, the historical jury is still out on some of them, and especially the ones that have joined it within the court within the last 5 years, their roles are still evolving, and it's very hard to put them in a box and summarize their experience and their contributions to the court. It's in some instances, I almost could say I wish we didn't have to.
Are sitting members of the court cooperative with the work of the Historical Society? I mean, if you wanted to write about them through the society, would they be at all cooperative?
Well, these biographies are not officially sanctioned by the justices, but a lot of them were cooperative in providing background material about their lives and also photographs. So yes, we have a good working relationship with the current court.
Some of the names, people you've written about, John Jay, Roger Taney, Salmon Chase is another, are names that people know from reading history. But who did you find out about who's been overlooked by history?
Well, there are quite a few. I wouldn't say completely overlooked, but there are several justices that I think are really outstanding that have been somewhat neglected. I think their names should be household names, and they're not. I would list Joseph Story, who in some ways was the father of American legal textbooks, and therefore influenced generations of lawyers who used the text that he wrote in school. He taught at Harvard. I would say, who else? Joseph Bradley is also a very distinguished justice who contributed a lot to constitutional law, who is not known as much as a Holmes or a Brandeis or a John Marshall. Let's see. Oh, there are quite a few that I think deserve more attention.
You just mentioned Holmes, Brandeis, John Marshall. Early on, I asked you about some of the people who had intrigued you, and you said there were many. But, I mean, you mentioned three here just now. Kind of going back to that after we've had a chance to visit, who are, again, kind of two or three people that come to mind as you look at as either pillars of the court or people who you found the most interesting? Not necessarily the one, but you know, two or three or four.
That's hard to say. I think the ones that are the most interesting are the ones that you know the most about, and the ones that I researched myself, I really got to dig down and read their correspondence, read some of their memoirs, and that is what brings history to life, and that is what makes it exciting. So I think the more you know, the more interesting it is.
The project, the illustrated biography, again took how long?
Oh, let's see. It was about 2.5 years to develop the book from start to finish.
Once you were finished, how'd you feel?
It was a big effort, but it was a group effort. A lot of people worked on it, so we have the book party tomorrow night at the court, and I think there'll be a lot of celebrating.
And this is available through the Society NCQ?
Yes. The Society sells it at its gift shop in the Supreme Court building.
And now that this project is over with, what are you doing these days?
Well, I'm living in Paris because my husband has been transferred there, and I've been working as an editor. The Historical Society is putting together this spring a lecture series on the Supreme Court and the Civil War, and I think they're going to hopefully work a book out of that, which will be very interesting to see.
Knowing what you know now, having done this, if you were offered a project like this again, would you take it?
I would take it, but I would do it differently. I would organize it a little bit better. It took us a while to get it going in the right direction.
Claire Cushman is editor of